I'm Abraham Lincoln, and you're watching African American Morality, Civil War Edition, presented by Yana, Kim, and Parker. Let me tell you a story about two sides of the same coin, the Union and the Confederacy. One opposed slavery, and one was for it. The Confederacy's main source of workers was slaves, so abolishing slavery meant losing all their workers. The Union, on the other hand, had about 3,000 slaves in total. This caused conflict between the two sides. Now, let's get to the war. You see, prior to independence, slavery existed on all of the American colonies, and therefore was not an issue of sectional debate. With the arrival of independence, however, the new northern states, those of New England and New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, came to see slavery as a contradiction to the ideas of the Revolution, and instituted programs of gradual emancipation. African American slaves in the United States can be divided into two periods. The first coincided with the colonial years, about 1650 to 1790, and the second lasted from the American independence to the Civil War, 1790 to 1865. By 1820, there were only about 3,000 slaves in the North, almost all of them working on large farms in New Jersey. Slavery could be abolished more easily in the North because there were far fewer slaves in those states, and they were not a vital part of the northern economies. There were plenty of free white men to do those sort of labor the slaves performed. In fact, the main demand for abolition of slavery came not from those found it morally wrong, but from white working-class men who did not want slaves as rivals for their jobs. Circumstances in the newly formed southern states were quite different. The African-American population, both slave and free, was much larger. In Virginia and South Carolina, in 1790, nearly half of the population from African descent. Historians have traditionally assumed that South Carolina had black majority population through its pre-Civil War history, but census figures at 1790 to 1810 show that the states possessed the majority of whites. Other southern states also had large black minorities, actually. Because of their ingrained racial prejudice and ignorance about the sophisticated cultures in Africa from which many of their slaves came, Southern whites were convinced that free blacks would be a savage, a threat to white survival. So Southerners believed that slavery was necessary as a means of race control. Of equal importance in the Southern states was that the economic role of slaves played. These states were much more dependent on the agricultural sector of their economies than were Northern ones. Much of the wealth in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and Georgia, came from the cash crop the slaves grew. Indeed, many white Southerners did not believe that white men could or should do the backbreaking labor required to produce tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo, which were the region's chief cash crops. As a consequence of these factors, the southern states were determined to retain slavery after the Revolution. Thus began the fatal division between free states and slave states that led to sectionalism and ultimately the Civil War. Now, the Civil War started in 1861 and it lasted 4 years. It was the fight of the eradication of the institution of slavery. In total, 620,000 of the 2.4 million people fighting died. And even more waged. You know, on the south side, the population was devastated. Thank you for listening to